Hi Tim, you're looking particularly snazzy today. What are you wearing?
I'm wearing a piece from a company called Grace and Garbo. And actually, you know a little bit more about them than I do, to be honest.
Yeah, you're right, I do. And
You're the fashion queen. Yeah.
I'm also wearing a piece from Grace and Garbo. So this is a delightful knitwear outfit set up in Birmingham. What they do is they source knitwear, quality knitwear from all around the world. So it's vintage, one-off pieces, many of which they then hand embellish, like the one you're wearing today with its beautiful purple flowers. And so they're big on sustainability. Nothing goes to waste. Everything is sort of recycled and reused. And if you want to know more about them, then have a look at the link beneath this episode.
And thank you very much to them for supporting our podcast. Hope their sales soar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Grace and Garbo.
Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Science of the Times. I'm Tim Colson.
Hello, I'm Syma Khalid.
And today we're talking about migration, so actually human migration. So we're going to be focusing on humans. And this is your idea, actually, Syma, wasn't it? You I think, went to a talk with our guest.
Yeah, so I went to a science festival, which was the literature part of that was hosted by the bookshop, the independent bookshop in Woodstock, and I heard a really interesting talk by Ian Goldin about human migration, and he's written a book called The Shortest History of Migration. And as you know, Tim, my parents are migrants, my grandparents were migrants to the UK from Pakistan, and I think it just really struck a chord with me, to be honest.
No, I think it's interesting. So, we probably all have a little bit of migrant in us at some point, given the way that people have moved around the world. I shouldn't tell this story, but I did a 23andMe genetic test not long ago and discovered I was 27% French, and I still haven't really got over that.
Excellent.
But I mean, I think this is a really interesting topic because, as we'll discover, it's actually quite hard to do scientific research on migration. I think this is something I found surprising from Ian's book, yet it's an incredibly contentious issue in many parts of the world, particularly at the moment. And people seem quite confused at times over the pros and the cons and what have you.
Yeah, and it's bizarre because, as you said, the geopolitical impacts and ramifications are huge, and yet probably, as you said, you found out you're very, there's a lot of you that's French, and it turns out that probably most of us are, a bit of a mishmash of many things, and so, but just quantifying that, yes, is difficult.
It's hard. Well, not wishing to make light of it, I realise that's why I like cheese and wine so much. Actually, I think the French genes, but but anyway, I mean, it is a very serious issue and an important issue and a really interesting one. So let's get Ian on and have a discussion with him, and then we'll catch up at the end.
Well, without any further ado, it's our great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Ian. Ian, would you like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are?
Thanks very much, Tim, for having me. So I'm Ian Goldin. I'm the Professor of Globalization and Development at Oxford University.
And you're actually an immigrant to the UK, I believe.
I am a migrant multiple times in different places. My grandparents were migrants. My parents were migrants. And I came to the UK for the first time in 1978, which is pretty long ago, leaving South Africa, where I was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And I studied here. I did my doctorate at Oxford. I stayed in the UK for a while. Then I went to France. Then I went to the US. Then South Africa became free in 1994. I went back to South Africa. And then after President Mandela, who I was working with, ceased to be the president, I went back to the US. And then in 2006, came back to Oxford. And I've been here ever since, very happily.
And the reason that this is relevant is you've written a book that's recently come out called The Shortest History of Migration. That's published by Old Street Publishing in the UK. And it's well worth a read. And that's primarily what we're going to be talking about today. And Syma is joining us online. Syma, do you want to kick off with a question or two?
Yeah, of course. So, Ian, we met a couple of weeks ago, I think, at the Woodstock Science Festival, where I heard you talk about your book and was fascinated. And I think I didn't really get a chance to ask you then. So, okay, your family are migrants, you're a migrant. But is this sort of understanding of your roots, our roots, something that's always been within you, or is this something that sort of you look back on now and it's been of interest, and then that's sort of instigated writing the book, or has it sort of always been there?
Yeah, great to see you again, Simon. I think I became more aware of it as an adult. I don't remember as a child being that conscious of it, growing up in Pretoria, in South Africa. But I became more and more aware of it, as I confronted the choice of having to leave South Africa, which I didn't expect to have to do as a child. I also became more and more aware that the riches of South Africa and the whole apartheid system of segregation and inequality was rooted in migration. I did work on that when I was doing my economics degree at the University of Cape Town. So I became more aware of it. And then as my cycle of migration sort of repeated my parents' and grandparents', I became more generally aware of it. But my intellectual and academic interest, which really is over the last 20 years or so, comes from a recognition of the extraordinary contribution that migrants have paid, particularly to innovation, to science, and the importance of migration for development. So the broader things. I did try and do another book, I think it's 2012. It's called Exceptional People, Why Migration Shaped Our World and How It Will Define Our Future, with Princeton University Press. Very scholarly, as you'd expect of a Princeton University Press book. Because I wanted to try and help shape the debate, but it didn't have much of an impact. So this is actually my second attempt to try and influence the debate in a book which I hope has much wider appeal, which is written for a much broader audience than a Princeton University Press book would be.
So can I take a sort of brief step back? How do you go about defining migration? Because obviously, given what you've told us about your background, it's not moving to one place and then staying there. Is it crossing a border? It's
a very complex question, partly because nation states, as we know them today, are very new inventions historically. And if you define migration as crossing a national border, there was no migration until the 18th century, say, when you really... passports and migration statistics and controls, as we know them today, are even more recent. They really didn't exist until the First World War. Yeah. So it's 120 years ago, maybe. So I define it in two ways. In the ancient period, and we talk about migration in Africa, migration out of Africa into Europe and then across the world.
So we're talking, 70,000 years ago plus out of Africa.
Well, 200, 90,000 first time out of Africa. Although these statistics keep changing as we have new DNA discoveries, new archaeological discoveries, and so on. I define it as sort of people moving away from their home range or their home area, rather than the crossing of national borders. When we get into the modern period, with the creation of nation states, it is indeed crossing national borders. But it's still a very fuzzy area. For example, different countries count people in totally different ways. In the UK now, we count students, for example, as migrants. A lot of countries don't. Some countries count a migrant as someone who's there for a day and others for a year. So it remains a very fuzzy concept, and I grapple with that in the book, but it's basically moving from one place to another, which is not the place of your birth.
And so one of the central questions, in your book is sort of what drives human migration. And I guess sort of if we go back long enough, my question is, what do you think was the first driver of human migration?
Well, I think humans have migrated for as long as Homo sapiens has existed. And that's an open question about how long that is, but let's say 200,000 years or more. And I think what drove the earliest migrations continues to inform current migration. So it's a combination of a push, like famine, drought, volcanic explosion, conflict, with some more communally related things. I don't like my mother-in-law and I want to go away. With a curiosity and exploratory spirit. What's over that mountain? Where do those birds come from? And occasionally, as other people migrated, where do those people that we're seeing come from? Or where do the herds that migrate come from? So I think it's always been a combination of push, like compelling people to migrate. If we stay where we are, we're going to die. And there's no doubt that if we hadn't migrated, we wouldn't exist today as a species. I think that's pretty well established now, that we had to migrate to survive as a species. And that there were these pinch points in human history where actually the Homo sapiens came down to very small numbers. And with a curiosity, with an exploratory spirit, which I argue in the book, and maybe zoologists will prove me wrong, that is actually what makes Homo sapiens a particularly unique and successful species. It was that ability to migrate, to populate all parts of the habitable earth, and some which are even less habitable, like the tundra zones and things, deserts, and that ability to adapt and then to pollinate across this adaptation, which has made us what we are today.
So should we ask Tim as the zoologist?
Well, so I was going to ask that question. So in some species, there are actually some individuals that are morphologically different or have sort of slightly different behaviors that are more likely to move. So a classic example is naked mole rats, which you find in South Africa, no less. And they actually have disperser morphs. Obviously, we don't have that in humans. But do you think there's sort of some personality types in humans that are more likely to move? Because clearly it's very unusual for entire populations to get up and move. It's unlikely a whole town is going to suddenly say, okay, let's move.
It's a really interesting question. And on aggregate, since we've had statistics, it seems like about 3% of people move.
I was really amazed that seems constant.
It's pretty constant for the last 120 years.
Yeah.
Despite, big bursts in violence and other things. I mean, there are big pushes. And then sometimes people that think they're not migrants suddenly become migrants. For example, the partition of India led people to suddenly realize, be forced to migrate. And we're seeing the same thing happening in Gaza today. People that thought the place is their home is no longer their home. They're suddenly being defined as being a foreigner in their own land. And that happened with the breakup of the Soviet Union dramatically, and after the Second World War with the redefinition of countries. So a small share of people migrate. Now, the question is, are these people different? Physiologically or psychologically is an interesting one. They tend to be the risk takers.
Yeah.
They tend often to be, say, the oldest son or oldest daughter, typically. So one member of a family is sent out to often send money back to look for the others, or as a risk insurance. In my grandparents' family, all the members of the family fled, but they went to different places. In those that stayed behind, all died. This is both true of my grandfather in the pogroms in Lithuania, and my my grandmother in Vienna. Everyone that stayed behind was killed. So those that left, I mean, they did that out of compulsion, but a lot of people chose to stay.
Yeah.
Now, it might have been that the optimists stayed, right? They thought things will get better. The Nazis aren't going to kill me, or the kulaks, or whatever, not going to kill me. So it's not clear to me that there's a physiological thing. What we do know, and you'll know this, Tim, as a zoologist, is the interbreeding that humans did with the Denisovans, with the Neanderthals, was absolutely vital. It gave us lactose tolerance. It allowed us to live at high altitude. It obviously changed some of our features. A really interesting question, which I don't know if anyone has answers to, but we keep discovering, is why did we survive as Homo sapiens and not the Neanderthals, who seemingly had bigger brains than us? And one of the theories is because we're more able to migrate. We were more able to move, and also there's some theories around communal bonds and other things. So I don't think, and it continues to be a debate, that there's a particular personality type.
Sure.
I think it, or psychological makeup. I think the circumstances determine who's going to migrate and not. But it is the risk takers. It is terrible migrating. You leave your family, you leave your community, you leave your home.
You may never see them again, right?
And you might never see them again. Certainly in the past, you will never hear from them again.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just unfathomable, really, today in the age of credit cards and WhatsApp to think about that. And yet people did it. And that's why I think they were exceptional, both as leavers and as people in the societies they went to.
Yeah, Syma.
I was just thinking the other side of thinking about that would be, and obviously I also come from a family of migrants, is that one way of looking at it is it's the risk takers and the exceptional people. But could another way of looking at it be they were the ones that were the most dispensable, so they were sent away?
I don't,
I mean, how do we tell, right? What's the scientific way of telling which one it was?
Well, I think this is social science, not science, or anthropology, not science. In other words, every circumstance at the local level is defined by what's happening there, by the culture, by the attributes. Is it the oldest son or the youngest son that leaves? Is it, the boys, or as in the case in the Philippines, the girls that tend to leave? That's very locally and historically determined by a place. It might be that there's some generalizable principles around that, but I'm yet to find them.
We should probably think about going for a break now. And if you're enjoying this, please subscribe, please like, please put in comments. We'll be delighted to do that. And we will be back in a couple of minutes. But just before we go, my wife's actually Australian, and her family, they moved out there. They migrated. They weren't deported as prisoners. But I was talking to someone over there not long ago, and he was bemoaning the fact, he said, in the olden days, you had to be a prisoner to get into Australia. Nowadays, they'll let anyone in. Anyway, we will be back shortly. Well, Syma, this is exciting. We've got a new sponsor.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're being sponsored by PinGui Bags International, who are based in Oxford's world-famous covered market.
They also have a website, don't they, where you can buy things. But you've got one of their products in front of you. What's that?
I do. It's absolutely beautiful, actually. It's a smaller bag. It's called La Petite Crêperie Mini Grace, and it's from their latest spring-summer range. And it's a vegan leather limited edition clutch bag. And I have to say, it's beautiful. So it actually literally looks like a little shop front, and it's beautifully made. So you have one too, Tim?
I do. So this is called the London 234 Crossbody Go Anywhere bag. It's made from canvas by Troop London, a British company. It's made from eco-friendly materials, and it's beautifully handcrafted. It's got lots of pockets, and it really is fantastic. So I'm certainly going to be using this to come down to the podcast with all my bits and bobs in it.
It does suit you, actually.
No, it does. It's great.
And so PinGui refresh their range twice yearly. So if you want to know more, it's really best to head over to their website to have a look. And we'll provide a link at the bottom of this video.
And thank you very much, PinGui, for sponsoring us. I hope we sold some bags for you.
And while you're there taking a look at their website, please also hit like and subscribe to Science of the Times.
Okay, well, welcome back. We're here with Ian Goldin talking about his new book, The Shortest History of Migration. And I think we're now going to continue with a little bit of trying to understand early migration before thinking about the costs and benefits. I think you've got a question, Syma.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to pick up on the Australia theme, and I'm also looking forward to Tim's wife Sonia listening into this, and we're going to go at him after that comment. But yeah, you see, in the book you talk about this question of how did Homo sapiens get to Australia? It must have had some kind of water traveling device or vessel, and I think that's still an open question. Is that right?
A boat, I think they're called, Syma.
Yeah,
It might not have resembled a boat then, Tim.
Yeah, could have been a raft,
Yeah.
whatever. It's a real mystery. I mean, just one step back. When people went to Australia, we used to think it was 20,000 years ago. Now they're talking about 45,000 years ago. You know, this is one of the extraordinary things. Just in the time I was writing the book, which took about a year, everything was being pushed back by tens of thousands of years. I mean, when people first moved across Africa, pushed back by 80,000 years while I was writing the book. So new discoveries. So we don't know the answer to how they got to Australia. We do know it was probably during an ice age. So ocean levels were much lower, maybe 20 meters lower than they are today. So some of the areas that are currently submerged weren't, but that certainly wouldn't have got you to walking to Australia. You know, it's still a lot of water to cross. And it's a great mystery. And it goes back to this point about how brave these people were. You know, they followed the birds, they followed the stars, but they really didn't know where they were going. And they still did it.
But they did get there. And they've made, and the sort of the Aboriginal people have been there, as you say, for 45,000 years, and they spread across the continent, and filled pretty much every niche that there was, every environment there was. They then, of course, suffered when many of them suffered, of course, when Europeans arrived. Just over a couple of 300 years ago, 250, something like that. So let's talk about, I guess there's two issues we should talk about. So probably one of the biggest kind of migrations, human migrations that happened in recent time is colonialization, right? And that has some challenging historical aspects to it. And you talk a lot, for example, about the consequences in places like India. You mentioned this before, of how India was divided up, also how Africa was divided up. And those, some of those decisions, some of those consequences still, are felt today. With hindsight, should we not have nation states?
That's a big question. Colonialism, the voyages of discovery from the 1500s, had an absolutely devastating impact on the rest of the world. And it's thought that maybe 400 Spanish soldiers led to the death of 20 million Native Americans, guns, germs, and steel. And similar things were happening in other continents, often later, but still happened. They also brought many positive aspects. The question of whether we should have borders or not sounds fantastical and utopian. But, I am extremely taken by the only experiment we know of countries willingly removing border controls on the movement of people, but also, in this case, capital and goods, which is the European Union. And the Schengen Agreement in the European Union has been the most remarkable success. And it was really tested intensely during the Euro crisis of 2010-11, when there were towns in Greece and Portugal and Spain where you had 70% youth unemployment. And so the question became, and at that point people could still come to the UK, for example, do people migrate for social security? And the answer is people stay at home when they're in trouble.
Yeah.
They rely on their communities and they stay at home. What the European Union has demonstrated us is that you can imagine a world without borders. Now, the European Union is soft center and hard shell. It has a very, very strong external border, and that's the subject of great political debate within the European Union and with the UK. But it's not as fantastical as it seems. And of course, what you see is countries increasingly, there's 100 more countries than 100 years ago. As the breakup of the Soviet Union, since then, we've had 50 more countries in the world. So you think it's your home, but suddenly it's not. And if you're living in Scotland, and there's a Scottish independence thing, suddenly it's going to be a different country. And then we go to Scotland, we're going to need a passport. So the idea that borders are immutable, that they're necessary, etc., is not one that I subscribe to in the way that some people do. On the other hand, we have the world we are, and we've got to manage in it.
But passports didn't actually exist until the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was,
Yeah.
you could go anywhere.
And in the book, I tell the story, which is written beautifully by some novelists, of their shock and horror when they first asked by an official for a passport. They literally don't know what the person's talking about.
Exactly. So let's move a little bit to the sort of economic benefits of migration. And you've actually got some pretty remarkable data that you report in the book. And in general, countries that take in migrants, actually benefit economically. I mean, and there's some pretty compelling data about this.
Yeah, there's very powerful data. There's the short-run data, which is what do they contribute to the workforce? What do they contribute to taxes? Do they take out more in Social Security? And the basic story is that migrants tend to be of working age. So you're not paying for their schooling and you're not paying for their old age. That means that they tend to be contributing economically. That's why they come to the economy. So they're contributing and they're not drawing on as much as locals. And if you create a situation where they can leave and take their pensions with them if they have them, that encourages that. There's a lot of evidence now that they increase female labor force participation, for example, because they often do work like childcare, like cooking, like other care, which allows women to leave home earlier if they've had children. Typically it is women. So there's evidence that they don't reduce wages, they don't tend to compete with local laborers, and then the powerful evidence is on job creation. So they're 3 times more likely to start a small business.
Yeah.
They double or triple as likely to be innovators, Nobel Prize winners, Academy Award winners, etc. And so when you look at the longer term effects on a society, the dynamism of society, what economists call productivity growth, how much output people are getting, you see these most remarkable dynamic effects. And it's very difficult to think, for example, of a Silicon Valley iconic firm that's not migrant founded, or their parents were migrants, in the case of, say, Steve Jobs. Or when you look at the authorship of Nobel Prizes, there's always going to be a migrant in the team. And this is not an accident. This is a feature.
But why is it? Is it, and it's kind of going back to that original first question, is it because that it's a particular type of person that migrates, or is it comes from necessity in terms of having to work very hard? You essentially it depends what type of migrant you are, but many migrants start with very little when they arrive.
Yes, I think it's all of these things. I think migrants arrive in a society, they often can't very easily get a job, so that's why they create small businesses to employ themselves. And I think they're also driven. I mean, we all know our local newsagent, my local newsagent, who's still working at the age of 70, has put both his kids. His daughter's a doctor now. And his daughter comes in and does the newspaper round before she goes and works a full day in the hospital. I mean, that is different to a normal person in society. And that work ethic and that desire to succeed and have for your children what you never had, I think needs to real sacrifices and a very strong work ethic. But it's also the case that I think they are the risk takers, they are the innovators, and they bring ideas. You'll know from your labs, Tim, that diverse labs are more effective. I'm not only talking about gender diversity, I'm talking about cultural identity and disciplinary diversity. And that's what migrants bring. They bring perspectives from elsewhere that catalyzes and pollinates with the perspectives of the home country. And that leads to new creativity. Because if you only have the same people doing the same thing again and again, you don't get much creativity.
Yeah, I think picking up on that point, you demonstrate nicely in your book that whenever 2 peoples meet, there's always a spike in invention and creativity, and that's demonstrable.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I think for us, me and Tim as scientists, it's important for us to have those facts and figures. It's not just you saying this. We know this happens, right? It's a very demonstrable phenomenon.
And you see it in the patent data. One of my research groups is patent data is one of the easily mineable big data sets out there. and you can identify the nationality of the patent holders, and you see these teams. And so we're looking at like breakthrough ideas versus incremental ideas, and it's very, very significant that the breakthrough ideas come from international teams. I mean, different people born in different countries.
But despite the positives, there's clearly migrants often get used as sort of a political kicking ball. There are people out there who see migrants being successful and assume that they've taken their jobs or jobs that they should have been having. That's a very difficult needle to shift, presumably. So perhaps just kind of speculate a little bit on where that feeling comes from. Why is it that migrants are used in this way as a sort of political kicking?
Well, I think it's important not to romanticize migrants.
Yeah, exactly.
The migrants are like other people. There are some criminals and bad migrants, and a lower share than the population as a whole, but they do exist.
Of course.
And there's some who are involved in things, and they do at times provide a threat and are used to undermine local wages and things. And that's why we need things like minimum wages, health and safety legislation, and ensure that migrants are documented and are subject to the same laws and rules as local workers. Because otherwise you do get a threat of employers using migrants as a sort of thin end of a wedge to undermine local terms and conditions. So that's important that they fall into the same strictures and that they pay tax, etc., as outsiders. So one is, and that's about as employers as much as it is the workers. It's about the government regulations and the enforcement of regulations, and I'm all for those. So I think one reason people resent migrants is because they see employers doing this abuse with migrants that undermines their own status, and they feel threatened by it. And that's right. Or one can at least empathize with it and try and stop it. I think another is that I think we are community species. And so when people do things in very different ways that we've been brought up to do them, or speak different languages, we sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable.
Or they might look a bit different.
Or they might look a bit different. And I think that's about a number of things. I think it's about ensuring that you're not competing on housing, for example, on NHS queues, on public transport. And it's noticeable that the anti-immigrant feeling around the world has spiked with austerity.
Yeah.
It's when there are cutbacks in social services, when the NHS queues grow, when the housing becomes less affordable, and it is with following privatization and things, people blame the other for it. And there's a spike with the financial crisis and the subsequent things. And I think COVID-19, which also came from elsewhere, we think, also led to this. The foreign is a fear factor. I don't think it should be dealt with by keeping migrants out, because actually migrants are a big part of the solution. We're not going to have affordable housing unless we build more houses, and we're going to need migrants too. We're not going to cut the NHS queues unless we have more foreign nurses and doctors. We're not going to get public transport more effective unless we have more bus drivers and others, and they're not going to come from Britain. And the same in the cost of living and food costs and everything else, and nursing costs, etc. What's happening in the UK at the moment on daycare is just crazy. I mean, all of us know people who depend on daycare workers, and you can't find British elder care people. So we need
blame
them.
the migrants,
but
you get rid of them, and then you pay the cost.
You definitely pay the cost. But what I propose in the book, because I think we need to recognize this legitimate fear that comes from abuse, is what I call a migration bargain, which is we accept more migrants into our society, but we ensure they're documented, we ensure that they're subject to the same laws as domestic workers, so health and safety, minimum wage, and others, that they pay tax, etc. But we also have rights with that. They have rights for being treated with respect, safe passage, etc. The other thing that's happened is that there's an absolute conflation of refugees with migrants of other types. So, you see the small boats coming in, you want to keep out students. or construction or agricultural workers. Now, refugees are governed by a totally different law set by international law. The UK is very poor in this respect. I mean, we accept about 10 migrants for every 10,000 people. Refugees, sorry, for every 10,000 people. It's very low. We rank something like 25th out of 27 countries in Europe on this. And refugees need to be treated with respect. Are they in legitimate fear of their lives? Are they going to be persecuted if they're sent home? If so, we need to keep them, and we need to do burden sharing. I don't think the UK should accept more than its fair share, but we need to accept our fair share. And that's a different story. And I think the conflation of the small boat story with other migrants is a big part of the problem. We aren't dealing with refugees as the human beings that feared for life. My mother and her parents were first, and my grandfather on my father's side were refused entry into Britain. That's why we ended up in South Africa. And you can't let this happen in a civilized country in a civilized time.
So, Ian, sort of just changing tack a little bit, I was wondering, I think our listeners, readers, viewers would be interested in your methods. So, I mean, obviously, we're a science podcast, and I think it's interesting for us to know what kind of data sets you're analyzing, what are your methods, and, in an ideal world, what kind of data do you need to get to where you are?
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, it's a very good question. Let me start with the last question, last part of your question, which is, this is a terrible area for research. The data is extremely weak, and it's not consistent internationally. I think I mentioned earlier that, some countries count students as migrants, others don't. Some count a day, others don't. The UK doesn't record outgoing, for example. There's incoming control, but there's no outgoing control. So we don't know how many migrants there are. And the ranges, the degrees of potential error are huge, like a third, a double. We certainly have no idea how many undocumented workers there are in the country. So the first thing is, even in a very advanced country like the UK, we don't have the data. And that's before you start talking about what's happening in India or what's happening in Africa or elsewhere. One big ambiguity. The second is the historical data is not really comparable because of changes in these rules, like bringing students in and out. And you've seen how the government and the ONS in the UK, the Office of National Statistics, have got themselves into a real tiz about this. We just don't know the consistency over time. When it comes to questions like the short-term questions of, do migrants take local jobs? Do they undermine wages, etc.? There have been attempts to look at, say, wages in places with high incidence of migration and see if wages are lower. The view of the literature is that these are not able to stand scientific scrutiny. There's just too much going on at the same time. People come to places for different reasons. And there's no data on the long-term dynamic effects. I did the first analysis of this for the US, where I tried to estimate what the impact on the US economy would be if, through certain control measures being implemented. It's as rigorous as I think is possible to do, but I don't think you as scientists, Simon and Tim, would give it a pass, because we just don't have the data. And that's, it is working in this field is social science. And I think I'm not even sure about the word science in social.
I mean, it's really, I find that, I mean, we're kind of running out of time, and I know you've got to get off, Ian, but I kind of find it amazing that better data aren't available, given how long you can queue in lines when you arrive in an airport or in a port and you're going into a new country, that those data are not are not collated, are not available for wide analysis. that people don't record who's left, right? I mean, that you know, that you can leave and no one's monitoring it.
In the UK.
Yeah, in the UK.
And obviously across European countries now there's no data. So it's very poor. And I do argue, and I recommend in the book, that much more work goes into this, because I think part of the problem, and then there's the separation between refugees and migrants and different types of migrants and so on. I think part of the problem is people have no idea. So you ask people how many migrants are in the society, and you get these numbers which consistently across the UK and other countries, the US, European countries, people are estimating 2 to 3 times the number of migrants in their society than there really are. The other thing is, of course, is that migration is very geographically concentrated. Some places, like London, is 45% foreign-born. And no wonder London is so successful.
Yeah, exactly.
Other places, and the most and is the least anti-migrant place in the UK.
Yeah.
Although it has and this is true of Melbourne, this is true of Vancouver, this is true of the places with the highest share. They will have about half of their population foreign-born. The places with the lowest share are the most anti-immigrant. Some of the northern places in the UK,
or some of the rural areas.
A place like Poland, a country like Poland or Hungary, Hungary I think has 2% migrant. It's the most anti-immigrant country in Europe. So there's also no correlation between numbers and attitudes.
So I think we better draw this to a close, but good luck with the book. I mean, the book's great. Good luck with opening up a kind of broader discussion. I thoroughly recommend to our listeners to read the book, The Shortest History of Migration by Ian Goldin. Thanks for coming on. And if you've enjoyed this podcast or any others, please subscribe, please like, and feel free to ask questions, leave comments. We've been busy answering them this week, haven't we, Syma, from previous ones?
Yeah, for sure. And if we can't answer them about this episode, we'll just pass them on to Ian, right, Ian?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thanks so much, Simon. Thanks, Tim, for having me. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, I thought that was fascinating, Syma. I mean, an interesting personal story. You can see why wanting to understand migration is important for him, given the amount of times that he and his parents and his grandparents had moved around.
Yeah, and they're clearly all remarkable people. I mean, I think he downplayed a lot of his own, his own migrations and the impacts he had. Because, as he said, sort of just alluded on briefly, he was working with Nelson Mandela at one point in South Africa. And then, he's an interesting guy. And I'm really, really delighted he decided to come on the podcast with us.
I think one thing that... it is a contentious issue, and there will be some people, who are not going to be persuaded, even after the arguments that he's made that migration is a good thing. I was interested in his distinction between migrants and refugees, right? Because his definition earlier on was migrants who have crossed an international border, but refugees have done that as well. So I think it's the way that they're treated or the way their circumstances are taken into consideration.
Yes, I think so. And I think, and I think the difference is, as he was saying, that, when migrants come over, they're off working age, they come over, they work, they sort of, they are seen. And this is the key, they're seen to contribute in a way. And then with refugees, they're fleeing for their lives. Right? They span, I imagine, I'm not an expert in this, I imagine they span a wider range of ages, and they're literally fleeing for their lives. And so the circumstances surrounding their movement is completely different. And as he said, the laws surrounding those are different. I also found fascinating what he was saying about, we touched on this when we talked at the intro about how difficult it is to quantify any of this, and how across different countries the information we have is different. And it really made me think, I don't know what, something switched in me, something that my grandfather used to say. You sort of say that we don't, in Britain, we don't have any record of people leaving and such like, but where I come from, or my family come from in northern Pakistan, there isn't even any record of sort of family trees. So I don't know who my great grandmother, great great grandmother was. Beyond that, my grandfather didn't know who his grandmother was. All he would say was, "She came from the mountains."
Yeah.
That's that.
Yeah.
And so the written records are so sparse that it
Well,
must be a nightmare.
and of course, most of us know our grandparents,
Yeah.
would have met them. Some of us may remember our great grandparents, but beyond that, I think a lot of people, even if their families have remained in the same place for some time, possibly with the exception of the royal family, have any idea or have very little idea about, where their great great or great 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 grandparents came from. I mean, it really it's a really interesting area, and one that I think it's interesting that the way that genetics is actually being playing a role here, where you kind of can work out a little bit of where some of your genetic variation, some of your genes come from, and I think that's why place thing companies, well, it's gone bankrupt now, but 23andMe or Ancestry.com are so popular.
Yeah, for sure. And going forward, of course, things are completely different for the youngsters now. We will always have records,
Mm.
and that's changed hugely.
I mean, one thing so I've been a migrant twice. I spent a year living in, 3 times, a year living in Southern Africa and Zimbabwe, a year living in Stanford in California, and a year living in Australia. And although each year was fantastic, it's kind of leaving home's difficult. And I never really understood the culture in any of those places, even though American culture and Australian culture isn't that far. And I really missed a few things about the UK. I mean, not necessarily the weather. The weather was often better, well, it was always better wherever I went. But I did miss pubs, bizarrely. And not just for drinking, but actually for socializing and for finding out and working out what's going on. And Australia, and Sonia, who comes from Australia, who doesn't have that culture, just doesn't understand pubs to the same degree that I do. And I'm meaning that seriously, not like just the fact I'm a bit of a drunkard.
No, no, I understand that. And actually, some of my European group members who have said, say, a lot of the times from Scandinavia, for example, have come over it, and that sort of culture has been something that they've discovered and have fallen in love with because they just didn't have it back home. You know,
Well, on that note, our producer Rich is looking like he needs a drink, so we better probably wrap up. And I'll see you online soon for our next podcast, or in person. I'm not sure who we've got next.
Friday, I think, right?
I
This is
think the next one that will be released is all about left and right-handed life with Tom Richards.
excellent. I look forward to that.
Yeah, and that's your expertise. It'll be in your wheelhouse.
Uh-oh, better do some
They
swapping.
all are. Actually, all of these things are in your warehouse. I'm always the idiot. But anyway. Okay.
See.
Yeah. Bye.